Welcome back to PLS 510. In this lecture, we're going to take up some specific forage considerations for beef cattle. As most of the semester has dealt with forages in general with the cattle operation in mind, I'm not going to go back over all of the forages that we have talked about so far, but I'm going to integrate, if you will, the type of forage and type of cow-calf or type of cattle operations up against the forage choices that we need to make to begin to have you understand and get a holistic idea of how forages interrelate to the cattle operation. To do this, we're going to need to talk about the types of beef operations, and I'm going to broadly separate those into the cow-calf operations, and we will look at spring versus fall calving systems and the stocker systems, of which there are many types. For cow-calf operations, here are all of the livestock that we might have or we will need on the farm in order to keep that system going. Of course, we need our mature cow herd that we keep around all year long. We will need bulls, usually always using bulls for insemination of the cows, but we can also use artificial insemination as well. We will most often, have replacement heifers on the farm to replace cows or grow the herd, or they may be for sale. And we will have calves. These will usually be, will spend most of the time on their mamas, but they will, and they may be and they are most commonly sold right off of the cow shortly after weaning. However, calves may be kept for 30 days or more to add weight, to wait for better market conditions, or as we will see with fall calving systems, to utilize extra pasture. And this retention of these calves is known in Kentucky as backgrounding calves. There are at least two types of cow-calf operations, not spring and fall, but we'll talk about commercial, where purebred or registered cattle are not necessary, and where the income comes from the sale of calves. Or purebred, where registered or purebred cattle are necessary, and the income can come from calves, from the sale of breeding stock, and in more sophisticated conditions and situations, the sale of embryos that may or may not have been transplanted into cows that are called recips, that receive the embryos and then serve as the surrogate mothers for these improved genetic calves. And for our purposes and for forage management purposes, the commercial cow-calf operation is easier to understand, and the economics in particular is more straightforward, and also then the economic drivers for our forage decisions are more straightforward. And so that's going to be the type of operation that I'll be thinking about when I talk about cow-calf operations. When you get into purebred operations, the revenue from improved embryos from breeding stock can be so high that some of these things can override our decisions for the proper stocking rate or grazing system, again, because of the preeminence of the genetics of the cattle. So we're going to be thinking about commercial cow-calf operations by and large. The types of stocker operations also vary. One of the simplest is the seasonal stocker operation, where steers and or heifers are bought in the spring ahead of rapid grass growth and sold in late summer or fall. These systems are not concerned with raising calves to a harvest weight. And one of their biggest downsides is the high price of young animals in the spring and the price slide that is seen as we go into the fall when they try to market these animals. Another type of stocker operation is the grass-fed operation, where the steers or heifers are grazed for a much longer period of time, and they do reach harvest weight and grade. The harvest dates depend on the customer base and can be limited and don't necessarily span all 12 months. A small grass-fed operation can say we're going to have meat available in specific times of the year that match the availability of calves and grazing for them. Then there's what I call the grass-fed retail type of stocker operations, like where producers sell to Whole Foods or through Marksberry farms. The steers and heifers are grazed to a harvest weight. That is true, and so they're kept a long time. But in this case, the producers must supply product year-round, which is a greater challenge than supplying beef seasonally, considering that most of our calves are born in the spring and then sold in the fall. And seasonal systems like that work great for the producer, but obviously we need a year-round supply of meat. So therefore, grass-fed retail operations have got to come up with a system that will keep animals growing and that will have animals at the right harvest weight and condition 12 months out of the year, or as your market specifies. And this, the retail grass-fed operation, is a much more complex forage management situation than others. I would like to contrast the forage needs of cow-calf systems versus stocker systems. And of course, as a reminder, the cow-calf operation is going to have a variety of livestock types on the farm, not all of which have the same nutrient requirements, but in general, we need a mix of performance and maintenance forages. Performance forage being high quality, low toxicity, in other words, non-toxic, novel, friendly endophyte, tall fescue, orchard grass, clover, alfalfa, and so on. The maintenance forages would, of course, include tall fescue, clover type pastures, and hay. For stockers, where we're trying to have raised heifers and steers and replacement heifers, we're generally always looking for the high performance forages. Those are going to be the novel endophyte tall fescue with a lot of clover, orchard grass, alfalfa, high energy forages. If you look at the forage considerations for cow-calf systems versus stocker, the cow-calf system is year-round and does require stored feed. We usually have to have 60 days of stored feed on supply every year, and some years we need 90 days or more, especially those years where we hit a particular hot and dry spell, either in midsummer or fall. The emphasis with cow-calf systems is on perennials and a long grazing season. Tall fescue is the predominant grass that we use for our forage systems. And of course, in most of our tall fescue pastures, this is infected with the toxic endophyte of tall fescue. We can use strategic use of annuals in these pastures and in these systems, such as crabgrass, annual ryegrass, and some of the summer annual grasses. And it's also quite common to have pastures damaged by winter feeding. For stockers, these systems can be seasonal, and we can therefore do it in some years without any stored feed or without much stored feed. The emphasis is always on quality so that gains can be greater than 1.5 pounds per day per head with stocker operations. Perennials are going to be important because they supply a lower cost. They supply nutrients at a lower cost, but only high quality perennials, and I've called them high performance perennials earlier in this lecture. Stocker systems typically have a greater use of annuals, especially the high quality annuals like crabgrass and annual ryegrass. When we move to year-round harvest, or even keeping animals year-round due to raising animals to a harvest weight, that increases the complexity of the system, and in those cases would require stored feed and high quality stored feed at that. If you want to compare economic considerations of cow-calf systems versus stocker, the cow-calf system is less volatile with less price risk. However, the producers are at the mercy of seasonality of markets for weaned calves, as prices generally dip in the fall due to the large number of calves for sale that were born in the spring, and most of our herds are spring calving herds, so therefore most of our calves are sold in the fall. The biggest cost in cow-calf operations is the cost of overwintering the herd. With stockers, it is a much more volatile, higher risk operation. The market volatility will increase profits greatly or increase the loss greatly. The biggest cost is often the purchase price, and the biggest forage cost is that associated with annuals and maintaining high quality forages. Looking at what kinds of forages make up cow-calf systems, and we've mentioned this briefly throughout this lecture and of course up to this point in the course, but fescue plus or minus clover, and it's usually the toxic tall fescue, is going to form the base for our cow-calf systems. We'd love to have more novel endophyte or endophyte-free tall fescue or other grasses in our systems, but most of the time we are raising our calves and our cow-calf system on a toxic tall fescue system. We can use strategic use of annuals. The summer annuals might be the tall growing summer annuals like Sudan grass or pearl millet. We can also use crabgrass to an advantage. And in the wintertime, we can use wheat and rye, and both annual and perennial ryegrass. The supplemental or stored feed is mainly hay from excess spring growth, but many producers are utilizing baleage, which is round bale silage, from excess summer growth, from summer annuals, and from winter annuals. Producers will also rely on purchased feeds like soy hulls or corn gluten or premixed feeds to overwinter cattle. Hay storage, and improved hay storage in particular, is going to be needed. Forages for stocker systems will be somewhat the same, but with a higher emphasis on quality. And by that I mean high quality grasses with and without clover, such as orchard grass or the novel endophyte tall fescues. We may use alfalfa. We may use annual and perennial ryegrass, crabgrass, small grains. We can use the tall growing summer annuals, and we can use native warm season grasses. All of these contribute very well to keeping gains high on stocker systems. Now, toxic tall fescue can be used if we manage it carefully and we maintain a high percentage of legume in that tall fescue. In particular, fall stockpile tall fescue can be very helpful in stocker systems, even the endophyte infected tall fescue. One of the large concepts that I really want you to internalize is the influence of calving time on forage management. I'm going to start with a spring calving system and build it in front of you. This is a graph of the metabolizable energy in megacows per day versus the months since calving. And you can see that right after calving, the metabolizable energy rises to a peak at about 2 months after calving, then falls here to its minimum at weaning. And then as we anticipate calving, they go back up again. The level of milk production in a cow from 10 to 20 to 30 will influence just how high this peak goes in terms of the energy needs during lactation and gestation. So let's add some things on this graph that help us understand the forage considerations for a spring calving system. So first, let's put the months in from 0 to 4. That's March calving all the way up to June. That's going to be here. Then these 2 months, July and August. Then we have September, October, November, and the last 3 months of the year, December, January, and February. So we'll draw some boundaries for those periods of time and label them: early lactation and breeding, early gestation, mid-gestation, weaning, and late gestation. And now we want to overlay our typical cool season growth curve on this. And you can see that we, in general, the shape of these curves tends to allow our peak growth in spring and early summer to coincide with this early lactation and breeding. And of course, in May, June, which is our typical breeding time, if we're on toxic tall fescue, we have to have a strategy then to minimize the effects of that toxic tall fescue in May and June. But you can see that this peak and this peak coincide. Then as the needs decline, that coincides with pasture availability decline. Then we have weaning, and of course that they're weaning, the mama cow does not give any milk anymore, and her only needs are for maintenance, and then as she gets towards the end of gestation for growing the calf. And you can see that if we get a bump of growth in the fall, that's going to do a good job of taking care of this cow in mid to late gestation up to a point, and then we'd feed stored feeds. So to summarize, spring calving systems are a better match the peak production of the cow with our highest forage demand. In other words, our peak forage production matches the highest forage demand or energy demand in the cow. We typically run the risk of having inclement weather during calving, which is March and early April, sometimes backed up into February, and sometimes in Kentucky we can have ice storms, a lot of cold and wet weather, which can make that a very tense time for cow-calf producers. There is less pressure on forage quality, in particular because when our pastures are green and lush, that is the time when the cows are out grazing and need that quality and quantity for lactation and breeding. Breeding, of course, occurs during May and June for March calves, and we have to take into account fescue toxicity. Now let's compare that to a fall calving system. You'll recognize this graph, the energy versus months since calving. But we've got different times of calving. In this case, it's September calving. So let's put the months into this graph. The first 4 months, September, October, November, December, is that time when we have our peak of energy needs. Then we hit January, February, and then into the spring and summer. We'll draw our boundaries as before and label the periods as before. And then we will superimpose our forage production curve on this energy needs graph. And you can see something right off the bat, and that is we've got out of sync peaks. Our forage production peak does not occur at the same time of the peak need of the cows. So therefore, fall calving creates a set of unique challenges, some unique benefits as well. One of the big benefits is that we generally have much better weather during calving and breeding. And so we have less stress on the calves and the mamas for disease and loss of calves due to that disease. We have a very high dependence on stored feed, and we need both quantity and quality, because in our time of greatest need for energy, we are in September, October, November, December, where we may have stockpile tall fescue, but we will probably not have enough forage to last very long into this period of early lactation, breeding, and early gestation. So in fall calving systems, the peak need in terms of, well, it should be peak forage production is out of sync with the peak demand of the cattle. Now, on the plus side, calves are sold in the spring here at weaning on a rising cattle market, and calves can be retained and utilize this peak spring growth in the spring. So you can take fall calving and you can make it work very well for you. And in fact, many systems have a mixture of spring and fall calving. But in general, it's been my observation that more and more producers are using fall calving. And in my judgment, it is because of the better weather during calving and breeding. So if you want to talk about the summary of the forage considerations for beef cattle, there are many different types of cattle operations with different forage considerations for each one. Our overwintering costs are the greatest input for cow-calf systems. Our stocker and grass-fed operations have an emphasis on quality plus quantity, and for those that are raising them all the way to harvest weight, that means we've got to produce quality and quality, or have quality and quantity 365 days out of the year. In both systems, in all systems, maximizing days of grazing is a highly desired output. And for that reason, we will try to use a perennial mix of forages is desired wherever possible. Thank you very much.